I
Gonna
agree.
make me cry, Rich.
Oh no, 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 please. There have been enough tears on this podcast. We don't want any more. It's interesting because when I was looking at the switch from Filbert Street to what became the Walker Stadium, is now the King Power Stadium. Apparently, as you mentioned, the Filbert Street site is turned into student accommodation for De Montfort University and Leicester University. The road that runs through it is called Lineker Road. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, that's right. And it always seems really messy. There always seems to be rubbish on the floor, and it's not very well
Yeah.
looked after. Which, yeah, it's a bit of a shame for a legend like that to
Mm.
his road not being in pristine condition. But yeah, it's called Lineker Road, and all the roads around there are named after nuts. So Filbert Street, and
Okay.
I like to change the way I walk to the ground as well. I like to sometimes when I go to the ground, go the
Yeah.
way I used to go with my dad and walk in that way. I used to park at the hospital, which is right next to the ground. If you're at the hospital, you can see the stadium. So that would have been where my brother was born. I was jealous because I wasn't born there. I was born in Kirby Muxloe, just outside, whereas my brother was born
Yeah.
within shooting distance of Filbert Street. Yeah, Lineker Street is there, and I'm pretty sure you can still. You might not be allowed to do this, but I'm pretty sure that the area of grass is still there where you can go on the pitch. It's a shame they don't turn it into something and really mark that it used to be Filbert Street. I thought
Yeah.
that campaign.
Same shame. Lineker Road is just discarded crisp packets, but there's a sort of inevitability about that, isn't there? So those are your first domestic games. So you're then a Leicester fan. Did you stay travelling? I mean, did your family stay in Wiltshire, so you had to do the
Yeah.
schlep from Wiltshire to Leicester over the next 5, 10 years? And was that a regular thing for you?
Yeah, so we go about 3 or 4 times a year, which I think I was disappointed by that. I used to want to go to every game, but my dad worked really hard. My mum wasn't interested in football, so I could
Yeah.
understand it was a long way to go. But it made it even more special for me. I think the fact I wasn't able to go there a lot made it really something I would so look forward to. And when you used to drive to the ground, you'd see Filbert Street in the distance. It was something that was really special. Whereas fans who maybe go every week, they become blasé about it.
Yeah.
It's routine. For me, it was always a special day out and something I'll be looking forward to for months. You kind of plan which games you want to go to. And yeah, so for the next 10 years, I go with my brother and my dad, and yeah, 3 or 4 games a year, and some amazing memories. Like I say, that was the start of a glorious time, bouncing
Mhm.
around Premier League to second division, but eventually going up with Martin O'Neill and staying up for a few years, winning league cups, which was unbelievable. I didn't think it would ever get better than that. Of course, it did in 2016 and 2021 when they won the FA Cup. But at that stage, it was some of the greatest times in Leicester history, and I kind of caught it at the right age.
And do you remember going to see Leicester at Wembley for the first time? I mean, you might have been in a playoff final, or it might have been a League Cup. So, do you remember the first one?
Sadly, I didn't go to those
Oh,
playoffs. It's terrible.
oh, you didn't? Oh, good. I'm
I'm
very
gonna
glad
be
about
yeah, because I
that.
my mum and dad didn't take me, and I still them to this day. I could have gone to the one in. It was so difficult to get tickets.
Yeah,
if you weren't going every week, it was so
yeah.
difficult to get tickets. You'd have had to go and queue up. And yeah, I
Hmm.
still tell my dad to this day that he let me down there. But yeah, so I missed some amazing moments at Wembley. And the Swindon one I could have gone to in the Swindon end because all the people who lived in my road were Swindon fans. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to I'm not going in the Swindon end. It would have just been a horrific day. And it turned out it would have been a horrific day because that was one of the best. You've written your book about playoffs. That must be one of the best playoff finals ever.
Yeah,
Swindon
no, it's
3,
up in yeah, it's
get it
up
back
in
to
the top
3-3.
10,
Yeah.
up easily because as you say, Swindon went 3-0 up, and you think, well, that's over, and then Leicester get back into it to get to 3-all, and then a ridiculously dodgy penalty, and Paul Bowden ends up at your school. It happens to a lot of people, but that is definitely a top 10 moment in playoff history. So what I wanted to do now is just sort of shift a little bit and go to the first games professionally. Um, and as I mentioned in my intro, you've been to every AFCON since 2012, but your first AFCON actually ended up in an amazing game and an amazing moment for a team that I don't think many people would have recognised many Zambian players. But talk us through that experience.
Yeah, I think this has to be one of the greatest sporting stories ever for me because it's got, again, what makes a great sporting story is emotion and the emotion connected to it. And so this is the Zambia team, 19 years before this AFCON, were flying to an international, and there was a plane crash in a place called Libreville in Gabon. Everyone on the plane passed away. So almost the entire squad. The best player wasn't actually on the flight, a guy called Kalusha Bwalia, who had an amazing career in Europe, one of the best ever African players. He wasn't on the plane, so of course he survived, and I think they played an AFCON not long afterwards and did well with a completely new team. But this was one of the greatest tragedies in football history, an entire national team dying in a plane crash. So fast forward to 19 years, 2012, Zambia playing at the Africa Cup of Nations in Gabon, where the final will be in Libreville. But it's actually a shared tournament between two countries, so Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. And Zambia aren't playing in Gabon until the end, but nobody would have expected them to get to the final. So this was talked about a little bit that, oh, it's amazing that the finals in Libreville and the Zambia team could get there, but they were complete underdogs. Nobody expected them to get anywhere near the final, but in the end they got to the final, playing against Ivory Coast in Libreville, and they end up winning in one of the longest penalty shootouts in international football history against an amazing team with Didier Drogba, Yaya Toure, Kolo Toure. And it's an incredible story, and yeah, covering it was a real highlight. And bizarrely, the plane crash happened on a beach in Libreville, and where I was staying for the tournament, covering it for the BBC, was on the beach. They gave me this amazing accommodation, not a nice room, but it was view right onto the beach. So this story, I really became aware of this story over the month covering the tournament. And Kalusha Bwalia, the star player who wasn't on the plane, who had to rebuild the international team, he was the president of the Football Association, so he was there to witness this. And yeah, it's one of those stories that I know this is a cliche, oh, you couldn't make it up, you couldn't script it, and that's said so many times in football commentary, but you really couldn't. And as someone who I was new to this, I was quite new to covering African football, but yeah, it was so emotional. I still can picture it now when they won the penalty shootout and they were running to their fans and celebrating. The manager was a guy called Hervé Renard, who's become quite famous, international manager, wears the white shirts. Managed Saudi Arabia when they beat Argentina at the last World Cup, and he's a real master of the underdog. He manages to get these results when nobody expects him. Players absolutely love him. I think he'd struggle to manage a team with big stars, but when it's a team of no egos, he can really get people playing for him. So yeah, it was something that I will never forget. It was an incredible story to witness.
Yeah, no, Reynard on the touchline always looks quite, I don't know, flamboyant. He's a good-looking lad.
Yeah, he looks like Dolph Lundgren. He looks like a film star from the 80s. I always think he should have been in a Bruce Willis movie from the 80s.
Lethal Weapon or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think he's also managed quite a few African countries, hasn't he, at various AFCONs and World Cups. So, yeah, when I actually looked at this, I was amazed that you say it's a very long penalty shootout, which the Zambians eventually won 8-7. But Kolo Toure missed the number 8 for Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. Then Gervinho missed the number 9. And you look through the Ivory Coast team, and it is, I mean, particularly for English fans, they're nearly all recognisable. He had Chet Toyota, who unfortunately died very young. You had Wilfred Boney, you had Sol Bamba, you got Max Gradel, Yaya, both Toures, Drogba, Kalou. Galaxy of stars there. And I looked through the Zambia team, I didn't recognise any of them. So I don't think there have been many Zambians. I mean, amazingly, for Leicester fan, you do have a Zambian player now who he started well. He started well, didn't he? He sort of disappeared a little bit this season. But what I also found out about Gervinho, who went to Arsenal, is that he was sent off on his Premier League debut for Arsenal against Newcastle. I'm now going to test you. He got sent off for slapping one of the Newcastle players. Do you know which player he slapped? Because it's quite a nice story.
So no, go on, tell me.
Joey Barton.
Ah,
And within the context of this podcast, I would say I quite like to slap Joey Barton sometimes. But going back to the 2012 AFCON final, the guy who scored the winning penalty was a chap called Stafira Sunzu, probably a terrible
yeah,
pronunciation. And he was a centre back. So, I mean, that's the great thing about penalty shootouts. Once you get beyond the top 5 or 6, you're beginning to go to people who probably never taken a penalty in a competitive match in their life. So that, as you say, that must have been an amazing moment when he scored, and then the relief and everything coming out, 19 years of this awful incident, then suddenly flooding out, and that
yeah.
must have been incredible to report on.
And the emotion of Ivory Coast as well, because you list the names. We talk about golden generation in England. This is their golden generation,
Absolutely.
and this was the time they were supposed to win. They always seemed to bottle it when they used to get to the big tournaments. And I'm pretty sure Didier Drogba misses a penalty during regulation time in this game.
Oh, okay.
So Ivory Coast went on to win the AFCON in 2015 when Hervé Renard was their manager. So he left Zambia, went to Ivory Coast, and he led them to win it. But Didier Drogba wasn't in that team. So Didier Drogba ends up never winning the Africa Cup of Nations.
Wow.
So this was a really emotional moment for him, and that was a special year for him as well. And this shows he's a big game player, Didier Drogba. I always think this is one of the rare games when he never really turned up. But can you imagine how he must have been feeling? So he's fast forward then 2012 Champions League final, Chelsea against Bayern Munich. He ends up scoring the winning penalty in that Champions League final, and you can imagine stepping up, how much emotion he must have. I mean, he's not like you or I, is he? If it was me, I'd be thinking, oh my word, I missed a penalty just a few months ago in one of the biggest games in my life. How am I going to do this? He's not built like me, obviously. He scores and Chelsea win. But yeah, I remember that really standing out. And you go down afterwards in the mix zone where all the interviews happen, the players walk through. And more than the Zambia celebrations, what I remember down there was the devastation of the Ivory Coast players and people like Didier Drogba, these big stars. This was their big moment to win it, and they failed against the team they should have beaten comfortably, and Didier Drogba missing a penalty. But yeah, I never knew that Gervinho missed a penalty in that shootout, because do you know what happened in 2015? Have you ever seen the meme that goes around on social media? So 2015, they win it on penalties in 2015, and Gervinho, I think he'd been subbed at this stage, although he's still in his kit, so he may have been on. Yeah, he must have been subbed. He's too nervous to watch it, so he grabs a garden chair that's on the side of the pitch. He takes this garden chair over to the dugout, and he turns his back, and he basically sits. He's got his eyes open, but he's sitting away from the action. He can't face looking at this penalty shootout, which Ivory Coast eventually go on to win. They beat Ghana. But yeah, I've forgotten that he missed one of the penalties. That must be why in 2015 he was so keen not to watch it at all. But they had an amazing team, Ivory Coast. It's one of the greatest list of talents that you get in an African team. It was a wonderful team. So for Zambia to beat them was a great story.
And then I'm going to bring you back to the UK, and also to look at, as you say, you do BBC Final Score, and it's interesting that your first game for BBC Final Score is one that resonates today, let's say. So take us back to that one.
Yeah, I've seen a moment of history, because I think he will become a legendary player. Jude Bellingham scoring his first goal for Birmingham at the age of 16, coming off the bench. So this was against Stoke City against Birmingham. And the big story going into this game was that Nathan Jones was about to get sacked. One more defeat and he'd probably get sacked. He was having an awful time. So to be honest, I wasn't really massively aware of this guy, Jude Bellingham. I knew there was a 16-year-old, but I wasn't aware of the buzz. The buzz about him hadn't really, I might be wrong, Birmingham fans might be able to correct me here. There was a massive buzz, of course, amongst them. The Birmingham fans absolutely knew that Jude Bellingham was going to be a star, and he was being linked with Trevor Francis, in terms of this young, amazing player coming through, broken the record for youngest player. But outside of Birmingham, I'm not sure too much was talked about him. So he came on, and the fans went absolutely wild. You thought, oh, hello, this is. They know about this guy. There's excitement about him, and he scored probably the worst goal he will ever score in his career. Deflected off about 2 Stoke City defenders, but it was on target, so it'll go down as his goal. He will never forget it. I remember his celebration. He ran over to the fans. He was you could see how exciting it was for him because he was a Birmingham fan. He'd come up through the ranks, and yeah, little did I know that. I mean, it was so quick that he's become an amazing player. He's still so young. He goes to Borussia Dortmund. Now he's at Real Madrid, and I knew he'd be a good player, but he just keeps on getting better and better. And what stands out about him, if you ever interview or meet him, is just his maturity. And for such a young man, he is so intelligent, so wise beyond his years. And I think we've got an absolute star, haven't we, Richard, going forward? This guy's going to be a Ballon d'Or winner. Surely he's going to be a Ballon d'Or winner going forward.
Well, I'm hoping that he might score the winner in the Euros final this year, but that might be getting ahead of ourselves. Yeah, I mean, you're right. He is incredibly mature. I remember seeing his announcement at Real Madrid. I mean, crikey, going to Real Madrid when you're 18, 19 must be absolutely petrified. And his press conference, he was very calm. Spoke a little bit of Spanish, not too much, because he'd only just arrived. But he just has an aura about him that very few people of that age have. And he also on the pitch, he's got this calmness. He knows what he wants to do. He doesn't get overexcited, and he generally delivers. So, as I say, I'm very much looking forward to him scoring the winning goal in the Euros in a month or so's time, and hopefully you'll be reporting on that.
Yeah. He's so confident, and even at that age, you could tell that he just did not look 16. He had time on the ball. He was bossing people around. I mean, he became Borussia Dortmund captain when he was 19. Yeah, I've never seen an English footballer, young footballer. The new generation, actually, a lot of them who come through these academy systems, they seem really confident, but he is something else. Yeah, he's going to score the winner. I'm confident, Richard.
Good. Now we're going to go from great success to less success because your first Champions League game involved a certain guy who's still involved in the media somewhat, a chap called Gary Neville. So talk us through Gary Neville's first game for Valencia as manager.
Yeah, so he was parachuted in, wasn't he, to Valencia? Bizarre story because he's Peter Lim, the owner. It's since turned out that he didn't really want to take the job, but he felt that Peter Lim, they had a really good relationship in business, and he felt that he had to do Peter Lim a favour and take this job. This was only recently I heard him say this. He didn't really want to do it, but he went over and took the job, and it was very, very strange. So I went over to cover it for BBC World Service and 5 Live, and it was so strange because the fans were just so uninspired by this. And it really showed me how English coaches have got a long way to go to build up their reputation. I remember doing a vox pop with Valencia fans outside the ground and saying, "Are you excited? Gary Neville's here. He's going to be the manager, Manchester United legend." And yeah, they were really upset about it because, particularly in Spain, English coaches, it may have changed a little bit now, but this is back in 2015, I think. English coaches, their reputation was really poor, and it was bizarre because he didn't speak a word of Spanish. I remember getting there really early to the ground, and he drove past me, Gary Neville. He must have had an early look at the ground or something. He drove past me, he was in the car, and he looked really nervous. He looked petrified, to be honest. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the game happened. I love Valencia Stadium. They've been trying to build a new stadium for years, but the old stadium is just a wonderful place. If you get the chance to go, it's very, very old and it feels like it's falling apart, but it is very atmospheric. And yeah, they lost to Lyon, and it was the start of things to come, really, because it was a really, really difficult time for him. I remember the press conference afterwards. He talks about the fact that he had a few difficult press conferences, but you could tell that he was in for a really hard time, and this was going to be very, very difficult to turn around. You can't get much of a tougher job than that, to go to Valencia for your first job when you can't speak the language. It was always, I think, going to end badly. I credit his bravery for taking it, but yeah, you could tell on that day that this was not going to go well at all. But it was an amazing atmosphere. Valencia fans are incredible, and it's a great club. It just seems to go from one difficult moment to another. Nobody really can make that club successful.
No. Well, I actually went to Valencia with my wife last year for the first time. And as I was with my wife, I wasn't allowed to go to the game because they were playing. And they had a really bad season last season, and they were still hovering around the relegation zone. But I was allowed to go and walk around the Mestalla. Oh my word! I mean, we talk about Filbert Street and the amazing old ground. That is such an amazing, and the steepness of the stands and the Batman low. It's just incredible. So I had my 10 minutes walking around pre-match, and then I had to go back and meet my wife. And Valencia is a beautiful city, let's face it. So yeah, I do have a fondness for Valencia, and I'm sure Gary Neville doesn't. I also find it amazing, as you say, and also there were still Peter Lim is still involved, or maybe he's gone now, but there was a lot of graffiti that wasn't very complimentary about Peter Lim. But not learning the language is something that really struck me, and I think that's a lot of problem with English British players or managers going abroad. If they haven't picked up the language, you're not going to win over the locals. And I've talked to you before about this. I am involved in an initiative where we try and teach academy players different languages, and some of them take it on, some of them don't. But I think it's really important. And you look at someone who succeeded abroad, Gary Lineker. As we were talking about, Leicester City going back, he did take on the Spanish and he was very successful. And then there was famously people like Ian Rush who didn't even try. And you've got to make the effort to assimilate. And Joe Hart did this actually at Torino, where although he didn't have a great time there, they love him because he did his first press conference in terribly broken Italian. I mean, it was pretty awful. But ever since then, Torino fans have taken him to his heart. So I think, you've got to go and make the effort. And you look at Valencia's performance under Neville. In fact, amazingly, he was replacing Nuno, who was the permanent manager before him.
Yeah.
But you look at them, beaten by Lyon, who'd already been eliminated, by the way, in the group stages. So that knocked them out. They then went out of the Europa League, and they also got beaten 7-0 by Barcelona in the Copa del Rey semi-final first leg. So it didn't go well for Gary Neville. Obviously a great defender for England, right back. They didn't keep a clean sheet in any of his La Liga games. They won only 3 out of 16. And he also was sent off in the Europa League against Atletico Bilbao when they're so if we're going to talk about managerial reigns, that is pretty much the worst you could ever come across, isn't it?
I admire his honesty when he talks about it. I think he talks about when he's up against Ernesto Valverde and he looks over and he sees Ernesto Valverde changing things during the game and he thinks, I just cannot do this. I'm just not at his level. And he talks about Diego Simeone completely ignoring him as well, playing mind games with him. So I think he's been really self-reflective about it. He'd have been one of those guys who would have learned the language if he'd been there longer. Phil Neville was there as assistant on the assistant to Nuno, who learned the language. But yeah, how can you manage? Not in Gary Neville's case, he was only there a short time, but I think it's impossible to manage when you can't learn the language. Jurgen Klopp always says he'll never go to Spain or Italy because he can't speak Italian or Spanish. When you're a manager, you have to make a great first impression, like I'm sure Oliver Glasner has going to Crystal Palace. That first impression is so important, and knowing the language. So it's absolutely impossible. I'm sure he says, Gary Neville, he regrets taking the job, and you can see why it was always going to be a disaster, I think.
Yeah. It was sort of in the stars, really, wasn't it? So I'm now going to flip back. I like doing this, flip back and forward. So I'm going to go to your first commentary game for the BBC, which was for BBC Radio Bristol, which has been mentioned before. With Ali Bruce Ball, who started his career at BBC Radio Bristol. So tell us a little bit about that first commentary game for the BBC.
Yeah, so I was still a student at this stage. So I was at Cardiff University studying broadcast journalism.
Yeah.
And I wrote a letter to a guy called Jeff Twentyman, who was a former footballer. He used to play for Bristol Rovers, had a really good career at Bristol Rovers, and his dad was also called Jeff Twentyman.
Right.
And he was one of the stars of the boot room back in the Liverpool days. And he he was a scout, and he picked all sorts of great players from that era of Liverpool were found by Jeff Twentyman Senior. So Jeff Twentyman Junior was a radio broadcaster at Radio Bristol,
Yeah.
and I think he enjoyed finding new voices and new talent, a bit like his dad in football. He enjoyed doing it in broadcasting. And Alistair
That's
Bruce
interesting.
Hall,
Yeah.
one of your previous guests, was found by him, so he gave me a chance. So I started off doing non-league games, Clevedon and Yeovil non-league then, and Bath City. And then my first commentary game, yeah, Bristol City against Cardiff. So I was dropped right in the deep
Wow.
end, this derby, seven-side derby. And I'm pretty sure that both teams were pushing for the playoffs. Bristol City definitely were pushing for the playoffs because they ended up getting to the playoff final that season and losing in Cardiff to Brighton, your friends Brighton. And
Yes.
it was that was an amazing game to commentate on. Again, you think about what we talked about for my first game at Filbert Street, and evocative, the noise and the atmosphere. But Ashton
Yeah.
Gate, when it's full, when it's rocking, this was the old. So it's the same ground now, but they've kind of revamped it. But this was the old stands. Wow, what a noise! That fan base. It's such an untapped place, Bristol, in terms of football. The fact it's never had a Premier League thing.
No.
When the teams are doing well, whether it's Bristol Rovers or Bristol City, they really create a great atmosphere. And I think it was 2-0. It finished that day to Bristol City. It was a really important game to push them into the playoffs or to secure their playoff spot. And when you commentate at Ashton Gate, you used to be inside behind glass, so you didn't get the full atmosphere, but you have headphones on. I remember it was deafening that night. Really amazing game, and I caught the bug really of commentary that day. Somehow survived it. That was a big game to do for my first commentary game. But yeah, after that, I knew I wanted to be a football reporter, and that's where I first worked at Radio Bristol for 6 years, covering Rovers and City and a bit of Yeovil Town as well.
Yeah, funny you should mention Yeovil Town because Ali Bruce Ball revealed his first game was at Yeovil against Bishop Stortford. And he said to himself, he said, I'm going to have to make a mark here. I'm going to have to make a mark. And he came up, this was a Boxing Day game, and he came up with the line because Yeovil won the game against Bishop Stortford. He went, yo ho ho at Yeovil. And he's always regretted it. And unfortunately, he told me in the podcast, so it's now out there for everyone to enjoy. So
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
I didn't think it was so bad, but apparently he got absolute pelters for it. But there you go. So going from Ashton Gate now, I mean, again, we're flip-flopping around here to Brasilia because that was your first World Cup game, and that was amazingly involved Ivory Coast, which connects, and also a player we've just spoken about did do quite well in this game. So tell us a bit about Colombia against Ivory Coast in 2014.
Yeah, so Brasilia, which is quite a strange place, an amazing place to work during a World Cup because everything it's almost like it's like a new city, isn't it? It's built for purpose, if I'm not wrong. Made into the capital, and everything seemed really close together. So when you were staying in Brasilia, you had view of the stadium and everything was in walking distance. So an amazing place to cover a World Cup. And I was there for about 2 weeks during that 2014 World Cup. Saw a lot of games, and the first one I covered was Colombia Ivory Coast. And you have to remind me of the score. So what was It
was the second match in the group, and Colombia won 2-1. So scoring for Ivory Coast, I mean, Colombia was actually 2-0 up, and the goal scorer for Ivory Coast was a guy called Javinho. And I've checked out the video. It's a good goal, cutting in from the left, going past a couple of people and walloping in. So there's the connection with your first AFCON final. But I think more importantly for the tournament was James Rodriguez. And, it was basically his tournament because A, it was his first tournament for Colombia. B, he was the top scorer. He scored 6 goals in 5 games, and C, the goal he scored against Uruguay is still so vivid to me that to do that on your debut as a 22-year-old or whatever, that is incredible. But do you remember, again here, I think the Colombian strip is one that just does sear into your brain because it's that yellow and blue and a bit of
amazing
red.
yellow. And
It was incredible, isn't it?
that's what stands out to me from the game. Actually, before the game, it stands out more than the match. I can't remember any. I'd have to really watch it back. I can't remember any of the goals from that game, but what I do remember is the fans, because that was such an amazing World Cup to be in Brazil and have the South American fans there. I spent a lot of time in Rio, and the Argentine fans were unbelievable. They were camping out. You meet Argentina fans at any World Cup, and you hear their stories. It's incredible. These guys just work solidly for 4 years, don't have any social life, sell their cars, do anything to get to the World Cup. And so it was great for the South American fans to have access to this World Cup. And the Colombia fans were amongst the best. And what stood out for me for them was that Colombia fans from around the world, lots of people who lived in the US, but Colombia fans were there. Yeah, that strip was amazing. That ground was one of the best stadiums I've ever been to in my life. And for noise, I remember watching a Brazil game there where they sang the national anthem, and the noise in that stadium was something I will never forget. But James Rodriguez, he was exceptional. He's never really lived up to that potential that he had at that tournament. He was incredible. The other thing I remember, Ivory Coast, their manager was Sabri Lamouchi, who ended up going to Nottingham Forest. He's had quite a strange career. And it was all that tournament for Ivory Coast was dominated by Didier Drogba, who was advancing in years. Should he play? Shouldn't he play? And Lamouchi just never got that right. He let the press, the media influence him. And it was a very difficult tournament for Ivory Coast because of that soap opera involving Didier Drogba, who was playing in his final World Cup, and he wouldn't go on, as I said earlier, to play in the 2015 AFCON, which they won. But the Colombia fans, South American fans, if anyone gets a chance to watch football in South America, I still want to. A World Cup, it's a bit different. As I said, it's a different atmosphere, isn't it, as a major tournament? But I'd love to go and watch a game in Colombia or in Argentina when it's a qualifier. It's just an experience that is nothing like the football over here.
Yeah, it's definitely on my bucket list. I did go. Actually, strangely, as a family, we went to Brazil just before the World Cups, a place called Salvador up in the north.
Oh, yeah.
And I went to my son and I managed to persuade my family, my wife and 2 daughters, that we were going to go to a football match. So we went to watch Bahia. And they were in a temporary stadium because they were building the new one for the World Cup. And it was it was almost like an athletics stadium. And it was a top league game. There are only 12,000 people there. And the Bahia fans are quite, they've got their little Homestay Fanatics section, and they make a bit of noise. But I can't remember which team they were playing, but they were from the other part of Brazil, so literally thousands of miles away. You could count them, there were 7 away fans. And they were surrounded by riot police. And I was thinking, is this really necessary? And then I saw at half time when the referee came off, they put them under police because they were just pelting them with stuff. So, it is an experience, but I definitely want to go to a game in Argentina. It has to happen. Funny enough, that stadium.
He's playing in Brazil right now, though, Richard. He's playing in Brazil right now, Crystal Palace legend. Well, not legend, but Crystal Palace.
Balassi.
Yannick Bolasie, I take my hat off to him. That is, I remember going to Brazil once on holiday, and Clarence Seedorf was playing for a Brazilian team, and I thought, wow, I admire Clarence Seedorf so much that he wanted to experience that. So I'm full of admiration for Yannick Bolasie for taking that chance to kind of play in Brazil. What an experience that is.
Yeah, and also interesting you should mention Yannick Bolasie, because he was the only Premier League hat-trick scorer for Crystal Palace until very recently. Jean-Philippe Mateta scored a hat-trick against Aston Villa. I just thought I'd throw that in. It connects somehow.
Jean-Philippe Mateta's getting a lot of mentions here. I like it.
He is, yeah. Well, so he should. So the other thing about the Brasilia Stadium, which is something I read, that after the World Cup, do you know what it turned into? It
No, did
turned
they?
into a bus car park. So they had the municipal buses used to park there because Brasilia, as you say, is the political capital, but there's not really that many people who live there. So they turned it into a municipal bus
Couldn't they play
car
football
park.
matches in there anymore? You
I
can't hold
don't
football
think they
matches.
do. Don't
Wow,
think
that
they do.
is so. Yeah, you're right. There probably wouldn't be a team that could play there, but that is so sad because it was an amazing arena.
Right.
That stadium.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we've been through it with Qatar as well, where some of the stadiums were actually disassembled. Some of them were sent off. As there's one that was made out of shipping containers. Let's face it. So, you know, did you? Last question, because we've obviously been on quite a journey so far. So, I assume you went to the Qatar World Cup. Did you find that a quite an odd experience in that it's not a football country, it's not anything with any infrastructure, so they had to basically start from scratch.
Yeah,
And
it was.
you've been to Brazil, which is a football country with huge heritage, and then you go to you know two World Cups later, you go to a country that doesn't even have almost a league because it's so new.
Yeah, it was odd. Logistically, it was the easiest World Cup you'll ever cover because everything was in
Yeah,
distance of the train. So from a logistical point of view, it was good, but it was a strange atmosphere. It didn't have the magic of the World Cup in Brazil. We've heard a lot of negatives about it, and
yeah,
yeah, I won't run through them. But the one positive I felt was the access to certain groups of fans which maybe wouldn't have had access to World Cups before. I mean, I
hmm
wasn't aware of the passion for football in Saudi Arabia. For example, the Saudi Arabian fans were extremely passionate, and the atmosphere they created in stadiums. For Morocco, the fans as well, they would have really enjoyed
awesome.
the experience. So in that way, there weren't many European fans there. That was what it really missed. I remember speaking to a lot of Belgian fans, and they were saying many of our fans didn't want to come. So it
hmm
did miss it from that point of view, and there were less of the South American fans, but it did give access to Saudi Arabia is what really stands out to me when I think back to that World Cup. The atmosphere they created. They had a little fan park as well in Doha, which was an interesting place to go and watch games. It was right next to where the TV studios were, and yeah, so it didn't have the magic of the other World Cups. I felt, but it did give access to other groups of fans. But the Brazil, how can you beat a World Cup in Brazil? You can't. That for me is the home of football. That's where you think football, you think Brazil, and yeah, the South American fans they are just something else.
Yeah. So I think that's quite a good place to end. So it also connects Saudi Arabia, beat Argentina, which Cameroon did way back in 1990. Argentina went on, as we know, in Qatar to lift the trophy. They didn't quite lift the trophy in 1990, but they got pretty bloody close. So again, whenever I do these things, there are lots of reverberations and cycles, and that's what I think is particularly interesting. Been an absolute pleasure having you on to It Started With a Kick. John, really enjoyed it. So, from Steve Walsh and Steve Bull's animosity, which didn't quite kick in because Steve Walsh didn't play in your first game, through to Paul Bowden turning up to rub salt in the wounds of a young man who was basically trying to get over this hideous playoff final loss. And then I think my favourite story is the fact that you were there for Jude Bellingham's debut for Birmingham, debut goal, and the start of this glittering career, as we both hope, and most of the people listening to this podcast will hope, ends in glory very soon. So appreciate your time, John.
We'll have to do a
And
special podcast, Richard, on the 1996 playoff final. We'll have to come back and.
yeah, that's going to be a particularly short one.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Still,
Thanks so much, Richard.
I still remember that goalkeeper you were about to bring on, the huge guy who was
Zelko
sort of going
Kalac.
like
Yeah,
this.
Zelko
Yeah.
Kalac.
and that put us off. And then, yeah, so Steve Claridge will never come onto this podcast. I can guarantee you that. Well, he might do. I'll give him a call. Anyway, been a pleasure, John. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Richard. It's been great fun. Thank you.